set.
Last time was awesome. I talked about it in my supervision. So awesome.
I mean, it wasn't like it's not. I thought,
Like to know what it would look like.
but I mean,
Morning, everybody, and welcome to Grand Rounds. A couple of announcements to make are that Josh Kantrowitz received a 2-year R61 from the, well, it's an R6133. It has 2 parts from the NIMH for a project on de-searing augmentation of neuroplasticity-based auditory learning in schizophrenia. And one of our residents, PGY3, Josh Kaufman, is the recipient of the Samuel Perry Award, which is given at a special Grand Rounds that Cornell has. Sam Perry was a long-standing, much-respected faculty member at Cornell who died prematurely, and this award was established his honor. And Josh received it for exemplary clinical and research work, but doesn't say exactly what the research was, but I'm sure it was good and meaningful. So congratulations to Josh. Is he here?
No.
Where is he? He's saving lives, okay. And next week, our Grand Round speaker will be our own Robert Remian, who will be presenting on the work of the HIV Center that he leads. So it's a real pleasure today to introduce our speaker, which is Dr. Pat Deegan, Patricia Deegan, who is somebody who's been known to many of us in the field of mental health care, treatment of serious mental illness, and has been working for quite some time now with members of our faculty, and particularly in Lisa Dixon's division, and is a consultant to the On Track New York program. Pat is both a mental health professional, but also a mental health consumer by virtue of her own personal experience. And she, I think, as much as anybody, is able to utilize personal experience as well as educational and experiential training in mental health care to convey what are the ways in which we can improve the way mental health care is delivered, and particularly with the use of peer counselors in the context of clinical services, which is something that we certainly know of and appreciate, but don't have enough in the way of representation in our clinical services, and that's part of why she's here today, to see how we can remedy that. So it's a pleasure to have welcome Pat back to us today to spend the time yesterday with members of CPI and On Track, and give the talk today, and then meet with the trainees afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Patricia Deegan.
All right. Thank you for that kind introduction, and it really is an honor to be here and to have this opportunity to speak with you today. I came down from Massachusetts yesterday, and it's nice to see the temperatures moderating a little bit. I was saying to Dr. Lieberman that the other day we had a low of 2 and the high was 4. So things are definitely on the up and up now. Today I want to talk to you about recovery after a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And I would want to begin where I always begin, which is telling you a little bit about my story of recovery after a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So I grew up in a large Irish Catholic family in Massachusetts, and I was the oldest of 5 kids, and lots of folks in the house. And, I think that like any family, we had our strengths and we had our dysfunctions, but nothing particularly extraordinary. Growing up, I always enjoyed sports. That really was my thing. And as I was moving through high school and you had said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would have told you I want to be a coach for a women's athletic team. My quest was to find out a way to earn a living and play sports for the rest of my life. That was really what I had in mind for myself at that time. And when it came to anything academic, or when it came to being able to, get good grades. That just wasn't my thing. So, if you'd ever predicted that I would go on to get a doctorate in clinical psychology and make this my field, it wasn't in the star for me at that time. But I imagine that many of you also have a story like that, the story of how you came to today, and it wasn't always a straight and direct and intentional line to get here. What was really unexpected for me was that as a senior in high school, around the time of winter break, between Christmas and New Year's, I experienced my first psychosis. And I didn't know that that's what it was called at the time or anything, of course. So let me tell you a little bit about what that experience was like. As I said, my basketball team and high school team, we were practicing during the break between Christmas and New Year's. And I was out on the basketball court, and I found at first that the first thing I noticed that was really strange was that my depth perception went way off. And I found it difficult to judge and attend to where I was in relation to other people on the court, and I was missing passes, and I was sort of quite uncoordinated. And as that experience sort of began to play out, I also began to notice that things didn't appear as they usually appear. It was as if the whole, especially objects in the world around me, took on a very strange and very threatening kind of physiognomy. So an example might be that instead of, seeing this as a right angle, instead, but that essentially it's a podium, I would just be present to the angularity of it and the fact that it was pointing at me, and that was very telling. I don't know quite what it told, other than the world was becoming increasingly threatening to me, and a place that was not benign, that was pointing at me and somehow implying something about me. And I became increasingly anxious about that. And my coach noticed that I was not myself on that particular day, and she said, probably you just need to get some rest, and why don't you go on home and shower up. And I did. I headed on home. As I'm experiencing these early onset of the psychosis, I began to hear these very distressing voices. Now, I had heard voices. I didn't know what it was called at the time, but I had heard voices growing up, as a kid. But they were always kind and gentle, and I never thought to mention it to anybody because I sort of felt like everyone else had this experience too. It just wasn't something to really talk much about. They weren't at all disturbing, and they were kind of nice and friendly. But this had dramatically changed. I didn't recognize these new voices. They started as a low murmur at first, but pretty quickly morphed into very derogatory voices. There are a number of them. And what was, as I look back on this experience, what was interesting about it is that unlike the voice of a preacher or a teacher, which if we want to, we find it pretty easy to ignore and be able to block it out and thinking about the ball game that's coming up or whatever, you don't do that with these kind of voices. At least that was my experience. These voices had a capacity to grab me viscerally, literally by the gut. And even though I might be trying to kind of hold them more at a distance, they seemed to be able to hold me internally. And and I found it, especially in the beginning, impossible to ignore these voices. Over the years, I've developed a lot of expertise in managing and even at times learning from these voices, but not in the beginning. At the beginning, probably the word to describe it was I felt engulfed by this experience that continued to unfold and intensify over a series of months. So these voices struck me as all-powerful and all-knowing, and they just weren't to be ignored. And so there I was, and I went home, and of course I was having trouble sleeping. And then I was becoming increasingly convinced over a period of time that the people around me weren't who they appeared to be. And so an example, I had some vague sense that some entity, I didn't know what or who or anything like that, but that this entity somehow or force had taken the people that I knew and sort of substituted some alien presence inside of them. And I was becoming increasingly concerned at trying to search people would be talking to me, but I would be looking at them trying to figure out, where was the mechanism or what was going on. And so an example might be, I remember my mother talking to me, and just looking at her, and in particular her mouth, and wondering why flat-headed screwdrivers, the tips of screwdrivers, had been substituted for her teeth. And this was of enormous concern, and it was terrifying. Well, needless to say, I didn't just stay neutral about all of this. I began to shout back at these voices. I began to barricade myself at times in a room, and it was very frightening, and I felt like I needed to defend myself, and I found it very difficult to communicate with people. And but I think that one of the things I want to say is that I just wasn't passively being afflicted by this experience, but rather I was actively trying to do something about it. I was trying to problem solve. I was trying to figure out how to manage this experience, but unfortunately, some of the things that I was doing were really frightening to my younger brothers and sisters. And of course, I had trouble attending at school or anything like that. And so within a relatively short period of time, my parents were not entirely indifferent to the situation. They brought me to see my primary care doctor. The primary care doctor thought I might be having a heart attack and stuff. And so, we did some tests, and I wasn't. And I saw a counselor, once or twice, and that didn't go so well. And anyway, within a fairly short order, I was brought to a psychiatric hospital. And once there, I was transferred to a teaching hospital at Harvard, and was pretty quickly diagnosed with schizophrenia. And at that time, not right away, it took a couple more hospitalizations before someone explained to me what that meant. But I was basically told that schizophrenia is a disease that's a lot like diabetes, and that just like a diabetic will have to use insulin for the rest of their life, that I would have to use high-dose antipsychotic medications for the rest of my life, that perhaps then I might be able to cope. But essentially, I can't tell you the impact of that, what I've come to call prognosis of doom, on a young person who hears that essentially, and for all intents and purposes, that my life was over. That there was, in fact, the discharge orders almost every time in those early years that I went to the hospital were pretty much the same, which is take your meds, take your meds, take your meds, and oh, did I remember to tell you to take your meds? Secondly, please avoid stress. And that was essentially retire from life at the ripe old age of 18. And this was, as I said, what I've come to call a prognosis of doom. And I think one of the things we're trying to do with the on-track model, because recovery is at the heart of the on-track model, is to not give such a prognosis of doom to young people, to help young people understand that this is not a death sentence, and it is possible to live a full and meaningful and incredibly wonderful life like you all have, and still live with, as I call it, the vulnerabilities that I live with. So there I was, and in those early years I was compliant. In those early years I used the medicine as it was prescribed, and my family was very invested in my doing that as well, because of course when I was on these higher doses of antipsychotic medications, that I was not having some of the behaviors that were so problematic and frightening for my little ones and neighbors and other things like that. And there's no doubt, and even on an experiential level, that the antipsychotic medications that I was first given were working to muffle my symptoms. And so, for instance, it's not that my distressing voices went away completely, but rather it was that the experience of them was muffled. And I did find it possible to not get all wrapped up in them. right? And the world looked a whole lot less threatening for me, although it still, I still had, and was ruminating on these ideas and trying to figure out what was going on. I felt less pressed, less pressured to solve it and answer these questions of what might be going on with the takeover of the human race. I felt I didn't have to answer them, at least immediately. So, I think that this was some relief. And I think importantly, I was also able to sleep. And it sounds very basic, and it is very basic, but, being able to sleep that's important. So I felt, that there were some things that I got out of these medicines, although I must admit, I think when we think of antipsychotic medicine, I would think about it like an antibiotic, right? So I know what I was like before the sinus infection, and now I want to go back to like I was after taking an antibiotic, right? The truth is I didn't feel at all like myself. And so even though some of these symptoms were much less troubling for me, the truth is that I was so heavily medicated that all I could do was sit and smoke cigarettes and drink Coca-Cola. I never was a coffee drinker, but I liked that high-test Coke, and stare into space all day. I had picked up the cigarette smoking habit on the inpatient unit, and I became an outstanding consumer of tobacco, and went into this thing that I do call the Coke and Smoke syndrome. So really, the truth is, what my day was sitting in a chair, smoking cigarettes, drinking high-test Coca-Cola, sleeping whenever possible, and didn't need a TV on, didn't need the radio on, just staring into space. And so for me, this experience felt profoundly disabling. I wasn't playing sports. And it's interesting because at this time, especially when I would be with my care team or with treatment professionals, they would say, well, maybe you should go out and play basketball, or being on an inpatient unit, and they'd try to get me to come to the gym for recreation and play. But it felt to me just too sad to try to play basketball. I knew what it meant to play basketball, and I couldn't play basketball in this shape. And so I didn't want to do anything. I just sat. And the truth is, I think at this time, as I look back on the experience, I was disabled not so much by schizophrenia or this illness, but by the treatment itself. And so, basically what my days consisted of is I would sleep from 8 at night till 8-ish in the morning, get up, have some breakfast, sit in a chair, smoke cigarettes. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd take a nap till 3, and sit there and stare until 8 o'clock, and it was bedtime. So it was a pretty bleak existence, pretty horrifying. And so for me, I was maintained outside of the hospital like this for many, many months, and interspersed with rehospitalization sometimes, because sometimes the despair would just be so overwhelming. I'm not doing anything. All of my friends are moving on to college and serious relationships and love and romance. And I'm sitting here, and I knew it. I knew I wasn't moving or going anywhere. And I remember one time, my mother walked by, and on the coffee table in front of me, she tossed a little brochure about schizophrenia, and it was one of these little handout things, that sometimes people get. And I said, why are you putting that there? And she said, no, I just hoped you would read it at some point. And I just remember saying, I'd just rather be dead. And going back to the hospital because now I was suicidal. Of course I wasn't. I didn't even have the energy for that. But I just was crushed by this monotonous existence. And so I think that the flickering TV screen, the old analog static screen, really says it all. And what's really makes this a little strange is that, my doctor, my psychiatrist said that I was lucky to be living outside of the hospital. And my experience was that I'm not really living at all. And my psychiatrist was actually pleased with my progress, and he said I was doing well for a, quote, schizophrenic. But my experience was of living in these chemical restraints that were creating walls that were as thick and as impenetrable as, and leaving me completely isolated from my world and what mattered in my life. And so for me, I think that this image really captures what that experience was like. And so in this kind of bleak existence, it would be punctuated with me going into the ambulatory care clinic at the hospital and outpatient department, and going to see my treatment team. So each month I'd go in for the standard med check, and at the meetings, sort of the same essential conversation would unfold every single time. So for instance, I would say, in one way or another, and not nearly in this articulate a fashion, but to some effect, I would let them know, I'm feeling really sedated. And the team would say, yes, Ms. Deegan, but you know, the progress is that you're not as psychotic as you were. And in a sense, I would say back to them, well, you know, I'm still hearing these distressing voices. And their point of view was, but you're not shouting at your voices as much. And my point of view was, well, I really can't think clearly when I'm on this medicine. And my team's point of view was, well, you're not as thought disordered, Ms. Deegan, when you're taking this medication. And my point of view was, well, I feel like the meds are controlling me. You know, I feel like it's controlling me. And they would say to me, but Ms. Deegan, when you take this medicine, you're actually more in control. And I would say, but I'm not myself when I'm on this medicine. And my care team would say, but Ms. Deegan, what's important is that you've returned to baseline. And I think the slide really says it all, and I think this slide sort of captures a profound impasse between myself and my care team. And in my work with providing consultation and you know, for a lot of years now, this is not an uncommon scenario, right? Where there seems to be literally a chasm between what matters to the individual and what matters to the care team, and that we're talking across each other, right? And literally, there is no common ground. There's no common ground on which the care team and myself are standing and having a shared vision of where treatment is trying to go, what a good treatment outcome is going to look like. With no shared vision, you know, my sense is that my treatment team was very interested in stopping the progression of a brain disorder, right? And by definition, the brain disorder could not be cured, and if left unchecked or untreated, would have a deteriorating course. And so that I wanted to have a life, they wanted to stop the progression of a disorder. They wanted me to be stable and to be maintained in the community, but I wanted a life. And I didn't want just any life, I wanted my life. And I wanted the opportunity to fulfill my human potential. I wanted my life. And so you can imagine that when there is no common ground, no shared vision of where treatment's going, that issues like trying, what am I like when I'm off this medicine, and the stuff that we so often see where people say, hey, I'm going to try this alternative or that, you know, like so many folks, I did the same thing, trying to figure out, you know, what is this? Now, you know, you might be asking, well, where's the team at, thinking that, that I was a treatment success? And I think so often the metrics that we used when we're looking at outcomes include things like reduced cost, reduced recidivism, and increased community tenure. But of course, the gross error here is mistaking the idea that community is that place out there where the Walmarts is, right? And that's really not what community is at all. Community is the nexus of relationships that we form with one another. It's a rich, vibrant life where my life interweaves with the fabric of my community, the economic fabric, the spiritual fabric, the arts and leisure fabric of my community. And that just wasn't happening in this sort of wasteland that I was living my life out in. And so now it felt like the person, the patient, it's the kind of thing where you say, oh, we've cured the disease, but now we've stopped the progression of the disease, but we lost the patient during the procedure. And it's true, I was lost. And so for me, in looking back on this, I say, well, what were they thinking? Thinking that this was, should be glad for where I was at. And I now understand that folks were working and their expectation was around the achievement of maintenance. That was the vision for what my life could be. I could be maintained in a place outside of a hospital, so-called community. So the maintenance model, as I see it, is defined by an understanding that people like myself have a chronic disease and that there can only be a guarded hope for remission, right? And that the word recovery was never used in relation to me. I never heard it. And that the focus in the maintenance model, and we see this maintenance model at work all over the public sector mental health outpatient world, all over the country, if not all over the world. And so in addition to this kind of prognosis of doom and the sense that there is a chronic disease from which no one gets well, there's also a phenomena that I call meds, manners, and money, where the focus of the care team in the outpatient setting or in the community mental health clinic or wherever you're getting your ongoing services, there becomes this reduction, if you will, and this notion that people are going to live in supervised congregate living situations, that the expectation is that folks are going to be on a lifetime of benefits checks, that folks are going to stay and get their activities in segregated programs, so that rather than going to the local community college for a pottery class, folks go to a day activity program where they might do pottery. And that what this ultimately means is that folks who are living out their life in the landscape of the human services find themselves living lives that are devoid of meaning and purpose. And I'll never, I was really impressed by in the early 90s, the longitudinal studies of people discharged from state hospitals in Maine were compared with folks with serious mental illness who were discharged from state hospitals in Vermont, and it's called the Vermont-Maine Studies, and it was Michael DeSisto and Courtney Harding were behind this match sample, and what they found is that when people were discharged from the Vermont state hospital, and the Vermont program was not a maintenance model, it was very much a rehabilitation model where it was expected that people would return to work, would live in integrated housing settings. And those folks tended to rise to that level and were able to achieve what was considered stuff that was too stressful, like work, volunteer work, living in integrated housing settings, at a much higher rate than the folks from Maine. And the Maine was very much around the stabilization and maintenance model. And in this Maine system, the rate of recidivism back to the state hospital was much, much higher than in Vermont. And when asked about it, and when written up by Dr. Harding and DeSisto, the thing that people told them was that, hey, when you got nothing to live for, there's nice people that are in the state hospital too. So like I can have breakfast out in my group home, or I could have breakfast, at the state hospital. It's all the same to me. In other words, when people don't have a reason, when they don't have meaning and purpose, when there's something that I'm not doing that matters to me, I got nothing to lose. And so I think that, the maintenance model does perpetuate outcomes where people are less likely to be connected to other people, less likely to have a vibrant life in the community, much less likely to have involvement in employment and other things that matter. So to make a long story short, I did undergo a kind of turning point, and many people, when you listen to recovery narratives, will define a point in time or multiple points in time where something really important began to shift. For me, what began to shift, it happened between my second and third hospitalization. And I had stopped taking my psychiatric medications, and not surprisingly, within fairly short order, once again became very engulfed and overwhelmed by these experiences and of psychosis, and that there had been no intervening learning. I didn't know any more than I had known the first time. And so I had the same response, and nothing had changed, and so I was back in the hospital again. And this time, the psychiatrist that was working with me, when I got out of that third hospitalization, and by then my diagnosis was chronic undifferentiated schizophrenia, and by then, I was coming back to the ambulatory care clinic yet again, and, he really wanted to let me know that it wasn't okay to go off the meds, and that I needed to take them. And he reminded me that diabetes, that schizophrenia is a disease that's a lot like diabetes, and that I would have to take these medications for the rest of my life. And then, as he was saying it, I felt something beginning to happen inside of me that hadn't happened before. Something, and I call it what was left of my real dignity, started to rise up and started to, inside of me just say, no, 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 you are wrong about me. You are wrong about me. And I didn't say that out loud. And yet this ember, this spark of what was left of me began to roar right over the top of the haloparidol. Maybe it was Prolixin at that time, I don't know, but it was a powerful experience. And I left his office, and I was walking down the corridor, and this thought came to me in a very powerful way. And the thought was, not only are you wrong about me, but then the thought was, I'm going to become Dr. Deegan, and I'm going to change the mental health system so no one ever gets hurt in it again. That's an interesting thought. This from I don't know, the thought had never been in my mind before. Let me just put it that way. And, excuse me?
How old were you then?
18.
No, the third hospitalization.
18. There'd been a series of rapids ones.
The three were in close proximity.
Fairly, about a year and a half. So I had this idea, and I liked the word angry indignation, or that phrase, because I think it captures some of what I was living through. Is that there was an ember of what was left of my dignity that just said, I am a person, I'm not an illness, I am going to be somebody. And I did feel like I had been hurt in the mental health system. I felt like I had been objectified in a way. I felt that I had been told that my life was over by very, very powerful people, right? And that I could not abide by that. And whatever it was in me, it's like being shot out of a cannon. There was just this fire in my belly, and it was just like, this is what I got to do. But interestingly, and I wish some people say, oh, it'd be like a holy host of angels come on down on top of me, and woo, off I went. No way. I went right on back to the chair that I had been sitting in, lit up a cigarette, and from the outside, you would never know that anything about me had changed, anything at all. And yet, and this is why I always say to people, don't believe your eyes, right? Because something dramatic had shifted inside of me, but I looked exactly the same, and you would have walked by me, seen me in that, gray-yellow cloud of tobacco smoke with yellow nicotine-stained fingers and lips, and said, well, there is a chronic schizophrenic. Because I looked like and I had gained a lot of weight. I was just the classic, right? And the stereotype, I had become it. So in any case, what happened from there? And looking back, what I learned is that, you can have a turning point, but it's got to be followed by some action. You got to actually do something different. So this wonderful person is my little Irish grandmother, Margaret O'Donnell, and she's a wonderful person, but, fourth grade education, but she's a very wise lady, and let me tell you how I came to know that. So there I was, but every single day, in all of that time that my grandmother would walk into the room, she would say to me, Patricia, would you like to go food shopping? And I'd say, nah, and she'd leave. And the next day she'd be back. Not 5 times a day, just once a day, okay? And one day, for reasons that I can't account for, and I really can't account for why that day and not a year earlier, I said yes. And then I added the caveat that I would only push the cart damn it, I won't put a damn thing in it. I got that stubborn side of me too. Anyway, so would you like to go food shopping? Yeah, and I did. So for me, that action step was a really profound moment. Something changed with that action step, doing something, saying yes to one opportunity. And so pushing a shopping cart down the aisle of an A&P supermarket in Cohasset, Massachusetts was my first step, active step in my recovery journey. And it's always a little humbling to say that in front of a group of people, because there is truth to the idea that, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that if it hadn't been for that step, I don't know what would have become of me. And when I think about, what was important about what my grandmother did, as I try to learn a lesson from this, one of the things I think about is the fact that every day she came into that hermetically sealed despair of a life that I was living. And not only did she let in some fresh air, literally, but she also said, there's an opportunity. There's a world out here. There's a better place than where you are right now, right? And implicitly she was saying, I can't carry you there. I can't make you go there. But by God, what's in my power to do is I will come in once a day and invite you. And that's a powerful lesson because, and I think it speaks to the idea that as people who care about folks who are struggling with their own recovery, that sometimes what we can do is we can continue to offer the opportunity for a person to do something, and that we simply don't know. We simply don't know when a person will reach out and say, I'm down with that, I'm going to go with you. Okay, yeah, I'm going to go food shopping, right? So, this was a really an amazing moment for me, and it was followed in somewhat rapid succession by a number of technological innovations, such as the Sony Walkman. This is the cold steel beauty of technology, I'll tell you. It's an amazing thing. It changed my life. The old analog tapes, right? And so I could mix off the AM, FM, and get it onto a cassette, and right off the radio, and the headset. And what I began to notice, I think I was given this as a gift, what I began to notice, it was remarkable, is that when I was listening to tunes that I really cared about, especially if I was singing along, or at least doing sub-vocalization to the tunes that I cared about, that the voices, when they would come on, weren't so awful, weren't so impossible to manage, right? And I remember talking with my doctor about this. And it's like, I know that sounds obvious, maybe on some level, but as a person experiencing it, it was mind-boggling that there was something that I literally could do, that had an effect on what the voices, my experience of the voices was. Wow. That became like this wow moment, right? What an insight. And I remember being excited about it and sharing it with my psychiatrist. And to his credit, he was interested in it. And he challenged me to find out whether or not listening to a Red Sox game on the FM portion there, would that work too? He piqued my interest. Might that work? So I like a good scientist, decided to try that out. Now, frankly, if I was listening to a Yankees game, I just would have had the worst symptoms. But I wasn't. It was a Red Sox game, and so indeed, I found that if the game interested me and I was being somewhat attentive to it, that maybe that would help a little bit too. And so eventually what I began to do, what ended up happening is that I stumbled into this notion of self-care. If you can imagine it, no one up to that point in time had uttered a word about my agency, about me being able to do something that would influence the course of this tidal wave that had sort of almost drowned me, right? And so I'm here today to say from day one, from the very first day of care with somebody, right? The very first thing we should be asking about is, what do you already know how to do that helps? That those of us with these diagnoses are not passively afflicted. We're not the suffering mentally ill. We are actively trying to manage, actively trying to do something about this situation, right? And I think that this idea of activation, empowerment, and of recovery itself is extremely important to convey to people from day one. And the point is that, when I think about it, as an American, we have a certain expectation of Western medicine, which is that, again, I have a sinus infection, I go to the doctor, I get an antibiotic, in a few days I'm feeling better. That's how medicine is supposed to work, right? Well, not always. But I definitely came in, and I think many of the young folks I see coming into On Track in early psychosis, they come in with an expectation of, you're the expert, you tell me what to do, and I expect to be fixed in, at least no longer than 3 days, because I got to get back to school or get back to my life. There's this fix-it mentality. And, I think importantly that is not how the things play out when in the recovery journey. And so let me step back from this for a moment and tell you a few ideas of how I see this thing we're calling recovery. First of all, I see recovery as not necessarily being about a return to a past self. Rather, I see that for many of us, recovery is a transformative process, a journey, a passage. Many of us come out quite different than when we were first entering into the journey. And for some of us, there at times can be a kind of grieving, a loss of, that athlete that I had been. This is a little personal, but I'll share it with you. I had this very amazing dream about a few months back, and I met this, woman who seemed to have kind of a glow about her. She was my age. I didn't really recognize her, but I somehow knew her. And as I looked at her, and she was very athletic, and I'm looking at her in the dream, and there were no words except I said to her, "Oh, you're the path I didn't take." So I felt like I met the self I might have been in this dream. What a beautiful moment, And there is a little bit of sadness there, but it's a bittersweet sadness, right? Because I wouldn't trade who I am and where I find myself today for anything in the world. So I think for many of us, this is a transformative journey and not necessarily a return to square one, although I have met folks who have that experience. But for a lot of us, it's not. It's very transformative, and in many ways, we come out with a deeper, more compassionate sense of ourselves and much less likely to be able to judge others. And also, many of us emerge from this experience, this journey, with a deep desire to help other people, particularly people who may be going through something similar to us. I think importantly, recovery is a nonlinear journey. It's not going from point A to point B. Rather, I think it has more of a spiraling kind of quality to it, right? So there are some themes that continue, even to this day, to be part of my world and part of my life, but my relationship to that theme or that life challenge is very, very different than it originally was. And so I think that the reason this becomes important is because many of us don't just go to the hospital one time and never come back. Like me, I went a total of 9 different times, my last being in 1998. And so for me, there wasn't this, I remember, especially like by the time I got into college and was able to get my feet on the ground and actually start attending classes and all of that, I couldn't believe it when I went back to the hospital in the middle of a semester. I just was devastated. I'm like, oh, I'm back to the beginning again. I'm back. And what I learned was, I was trying out something new. You see, I was at the point where I was decreasing my medication with my psychiatrist and increasing my use of the Walkman and other things I learned how to do to manage some of these experiences, right? And I had taken too big a step. And that's all. So I began to say to myself, no, this isn't a breakdown. I just broke through. I'm having a breakthrough. And I just need to recalibrate myself a little bit and get back out there. And so that's an important and hope-filled message. It's not a breakdown. You didn't go back to square one. I'm not sure you can go back to square one, right? You learn something along the way. I also would say that recovery is not equivalent to being symptom-free. I was, at the beginning, I thought that that's what it meant. But I think at this point, you know, at some point in this journey, I just decided these aren't symptoms, this is Pat Deegan. This is who I am. This is how I roll, you know? But here's the big thing that I learned, is that I know you guys all look really together and polished and shiny out there right now, and you're all, but I know that beneath that facade, you too are living with vulnerabilities, just like me. And maybe you don't have the same vulnerabilities I have, and that's cool, right? I know that if I get on an airplane and I'm going to fly to California, and between the white noise of the jet engines and the recirculating white noise of the air recirculating in the cabin, that I am going to hear voices. And maybe you're not going to, right? But today, okay, it's not a Walkman. I got a nice iPhone in my pocket, right? But the same principle works, right? So, you know, I'm not blown away by that. I can live with that. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean being symptom-free. And I think that that's a big aha moment as we study to be clinicians or as we're beginning our practice. I already mentioned that we don't recover the way a car gets tuned up. This issue of activation. How do we help the person we're working with from day one to get on fire about reclaiming their lives or undergoing this transformative journey? How do we awaken our recovery partner? How do we work with the person in a partnership as opposed to trying to just fix them or do things or apply treatment to them? I think another thing that recovery means is that it's also a very existential journey. We're human beings. We have full subjective lives, right? And that my understanding of what I was experiencing changed over time. In the beginning, I found the diagnosis, honestly, to at least, it sounded impressive, schizophrenia, that sounds impressive. And I was a little bit relieved because it's like, oh, there's a name for this. I get it, there's a name for this. Okay, that means that we can do something about this. And that's where I started. But over time, my understanding of what it was I was going through changed and morphed and evolved, like I was evolving, right? And so now looking back, I think that, you know, I struggled with developmental childhood trauma, and I think that many, many of us struggle with it. And in the beginning, when I raised these issues with my care team, I was told, quote unquote, and this is because I remember, because I didn't know what it meant, Miss Deegan, you don't have the ego strength to deal with that. And I didn't know what it meant, but it didn't sound good. So it took me until I was in my mid-30s to find a therapist who was willing to work with a person with my diagnosis and still talk about trauma. And this is one of the big issues that still face us in our fields, is that we need to begin thinking about trauma and trauma-informed work and how to make the healing from trauma part of what we do. Also, I think equally important was my efforts to recover from the role of being a mental patient. And you might say, well, what's that all about? Well, first off, it's not a glamorous diagnosis by any stretch. It's a highly stigmatized identity. And it goes, and that stigma, that discrimination really ripples throughout our culture and throughout my life. So, for instance, we see that people with psychiatric diagnoses, particularly of a significant mental illness, are extremely unemployed when compared to the general population, that we die a whole lot earlier than non-diagnosed people, that we are also dying from unwanted effects of medications at times. We also are, I think there's well-documented disparities in our health care. So, for instance, cardiac issues very often are not followed up with or even diagnosed early enough, and people dying of cardiac diseases because this is sometimes what gets called diagnostic overshadowing, where a health professional thinks, oh, these complaints are all in your head. right? These complaints are all in your head. And that results sometimes, not always, but sometimes in poor medical care. I think that also there's the whole element of sort of internalized self-hatred, sort of the contaminated identity. And so for a long time, I kind of closeted myself away and I wouldn't come out to anybody. We at the time didn't have the protections we have under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So throughout graduate school, I wasn't exactly forthcoming with my professors about my status as a mental patient. And for fear, as many people I know have shared with me, that I would be told that someone with your diagnosis can't possibly work in the helping professions. Find another vocation. So there's a whole process of recovering from this mental patient role, this devalued role. And for me, that meant really, the healing there occurred for me by meeting other peers that I admired, that I looked up to, and that I loved. Wow, here's somebody, who's been through what I've been through. And I look in her eyes and I admire her and I think the world of her and say, well, maybe I'm not that bad. Maybe I don't need to be ashamed. Maybe I don't need to hide away. Maybe I'm okay, because I sure think she's awesome. Maybe I am too. I mentioned healing from trauma, which I think we just don't really have our head well enough around this area, particularly in our culture, which seems to me anyway to be getting increasingly violent as these young people, show up at high school and see or elementary school and see people shot and dead, and just the power of that. And then, of course, there's SAMHSA's definition, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, that talk about health, home, purpose, and community, living a self-determined life. That's what recovery is all about. So then, what we talk about a lot now is recovery-oriented practice. And what does that mean? Well, some of the cornerstones of the recovery-oriented practice is that instead of giving people a prognosis of doom, we're going to convey hope to folks. We need to begin to do what I think Monet talked about, which is the unseeing. So we go to school, we spend a lot of money, we get a lot of expert guidance as we learn to be experts in the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. And then, I think to be an effective recovery-oriented clinician, when we're meeting with an individual, we need to become proficient in being able to unsee that diagnosis. Monet said, in order to see, we must forget the name of the thing we look at, right? And you remember his water lilies. Beautiful series of about 250 paintings, right? And his thing was, in order to come back here 250 times and paint essentially the same scene, I have to unsee it. I have to forget the name of the thing I'm looking at, right? And I need to just be present to the shadow and to the light. We need to unsee the diagnosis and realize that every single person coming through the door is, in fact, a person, and that is the common ground of our shared humanity, where we meet people and all the work begins. We also, from day one, as I mentioned, need to be able to find our recovery partner. We need to get the focus off of what's the matter with you and start asking people what matters to you. That's the key to recovery-oriented practice, getting on board with what matters to folks. And then finally, I'm a strong believer in shared decision-making, and what that means for me is making sure that the folks we're working with have an active voice and a choice in what their care is all about. So just very briefly, and then we're going to open it to questions, want to say, the way I've taken this up in my work, in my life now, is I run a small company, and in my company, we make something called the CommonGround program, which includes a variety of aspects, including an online recovery library and also a software program. And what I've done in my work with the CommonGround program, and what we do in my company, is we've sort of said, okay, this is your classic medication, your psychiatric med visit, your classic typical med check is that people check in, they wait in a waiting room, they see the doctor, they answer questions, treatment is prescribed, and they check out. And during that very often 15 to 20 minute med consult, psychiatrists need to routinely perform, I remember Will Torrey writing his paper about this, at least 17 different routine tasks, everything from assessing current side effects to making medications adjustment to checking orders and labs, etc. Right? And I said, what could change here? Well, one thing that could change is we could petition Medicaid to increase the amount of time people can, reimbursable time that folks can see. And I said, that's not going to happen. So I went for the next thing, and I said, well, I think what I might be able to do is to think about a way to re-engineer the care pathway. Because I think given my own history and what I've come to know is important is really when you get into a room with a psychiatrist, there are two experts in that room. Psychiatrist is an expert in this care and treatment of people diagnosed with psychiatric disorders, but I'm an expert in me. And the only way treatment makes sense or is effective is when we can bring those two things together, when we can start there. And so, I'm very interested in the question, not so much how do we change the behavior or train psychiatrists differently, but I'm more interested in the question of how can we activate and empower? What are the tools in which we can use to activate and empower mental health service users, the person coming for care, to give them the tools to have a different kind of conversation with the care provider. And so in the CommonGround program, what we do is people come in, they check in as usual. These are standard med clinics or they're ACT teams, et cetera. And what happens is that we establish what's called a peer-run decision support center right there in the mental health center. So people come to med clinic, they check in, the peer supporter greets you, says, hey, welcome back, haven't seen you in a while. Then what we do is we offer people a beverage and something to eat, and a person gets to spend about a half hour with peer specialists in the decision support center prior to seeing the doctor, right? And during that 30-minute period, a peer specialist and the individual work together on whatever it is that the peer is bringing in that they want to do to get prepared to participate in having a conversation with their doctor and having a successful appointment. And so lots of things can happen, right? And peer specialists are there to help the people, to help folks do their health report on the computer, which forwards then into the psychiatrist's office. And in that health report, people are talking about their goals and what matters to them and how they're doing since the last visit. Then I go in and see the doctor. The doctor has access to my health report. We arrive at a shared decision about the next steps in my treatment. But then what's interesting is my health report's also available to anyone on my care team, right? So my voice is brought to the center of the care team via the software program, the web application. But also the information that I've learned, the skills I've gained through my work with the peer specialist and my meeting with my doctor, then come out into my community where I live, which is where the bulk of recovery happens. And so it kind of goes like that, making us a full circle around. So let me show you what it looks like. We talked about recovery-oriented practice being about conveying hope, and I think that that's something that peer specialists can do really, really well, is that it's amazing how many times we hear it, oh my gosh, I remember you from when you were at the state hospital, and today you're working and getting paid. Maybe there's hope for me too. That's just on a very kind of superficial level, the power of peer support, but peer specialists are very good at introducing themselves as people in recovery who are here to support you. And one of the things I find powerful about this model of a way of doing things is that peer support is available in many communities, which is awesome. But the reason it's so powerful, I think, to have a decision support center that's peer run is that it also, these peer specialists, you think about almost 100% of people come into clinic actually use the med clinic, right? So this is peer support touching at a peer-to-peer level the lives of pretty much everyone coming in for care. We talked about finding our recovery partner, and the way the CommonGround program works that is by helping people real early on, peer specialists support peers in discovering what we call personal medicine. And personal medicine, it's what we do to get well and to stay well. Personal medicines are also the things that give meaning and purpose to my life. And so the beauty of this is that I learn right from day one in a decision support center through my peers who use our methods to help people discover their personal medicine, that, oh gosh, if I'm here for a tune-up, the way a car gets fixed, that's not the way things work. I have to be a part of the solution. And that's very powerful. So here's some examples. Clinicians seem to, examples of personal medicine could be anything from doing my art to, stroking my cat when I get too anxious, because that helps me feel less anxious and get grounded. Those are the kinds of things that people discover. And what we find is that clinicians really begin to welcome people who are more engaged and more activated in their own care. So you can see this particular staff psychiatrist reminding people, don't forget to use your personal medicine in your recovery. Then we have another aspect of the program in which people are focused on what we call power statements. And power statements are carefully crafted self-advocacy statements, right? And they do three important things. A power statement says who I am as a person, not a patient, how I want treatment to help me, and also how I want the doctor or my therapist or my case manager to work with me to achieve my goal. So here's an example of a power statement. I am a young man that likes skateboarding. Being able to go back to school is the most important thing to me. I want to work with you to find a medicine that helps me focus and be less paranoid so I can go back to school and complete it. And so you can see that this is a very carefully crafted statement that goes into the computer program and appears every single time the psychiatrist and the individual meets together. The power statement, of course, also informs the overall treatment plan at the clinic for the individual. And it is a very powerful expression, and it's one that helps to avoid that chasm that I talked about earlier, that helps to create a shared vision for where care is going and how we'll know if treatment is a success. So for me, a power statement is like an N of 1 study. And frankly, if this young person is not making it back to school, then treatment hasn't succeeded yet. You know, and that if and when, here's an example of another, growing as a mom is important to me. I want to work with you to find medicine that will help me concentrate and organize my thinking better so I can regain custody of my kids, care for my children, write poetry, and journal. Well, if care isn't focused on this outcome, that any kind of symptom reduction that's going to go on is going to be in the service of this outcome. Right? So maybe you've increased community tenure, maybe there's lower recidivism rates. I'm not impressed. I'm not impressed until I see this particular individual either continuing or being able to successfully get her kids out of custody, care for her children, right, and do her journal work, right? These are the metrics that matter to the individual. And as clinicians, power statements give us an early on, I mean, people are doing these personal medicines and power statements at the second or third visits to decision support centers. And all of this information is in the health report. And then, of course, I've mentioned shared decision-making. And that's where people's work in the decision support center really comes to fruition, right? Because in that half hour with the peer specialists at the DSC, you know, I've entered my personal medicine, I've entered my power statement, I've gotten information about a side effect that's of concern, or maybe I've needed to get some other types of information so I can talk to my doctor today or get the outcomes that I want. And I put all of that into the health report. And the health report helps people express in a very condensed way what it is that's on their mind, how they see things. It's a self-inventory, right? We're not using any standardized norm scales. It's not measurement-based practice. So in this scene, you can see Eddie working with Dr. Leeson. He's expressing his concerns about side effects, and they're looking at some of the back data and seeing that the side effects, you know, I'm not sure if they were getting worse or better or whatever. So here's an example of a shared decision. We define a shared decision as saying what I will do between now and the next appointment to support my recovery. So you can see a copy of what the health report looks like. This is, of course, all digitized on the computer, but the person walks in with a paper copy of it as well. We agree between now and my next appointment, I will keep a sleep calendar to track if the new dose is helping me sleep, and I will walk to work because exercise can help me sleep better too. So we always want to see in the shared decision in order to reach fidelity. We do have a very robust fidelity tool. And in order to reach fidelity, the shared decisions have to not just say what it is I'm going to do in terms of psychiatric medicine, but also say something about what I'm going to do to support my own recovery. Again, reinforcing that idea that I am an active player in my own life and I can make a difference in achieving my goals. So I want you to hear from Krista. She's a peer supporter working in a decision support center, and her experience with one of our tools. Hey guys, it's Pat Deegan. I'm here at Human Services, and we're going to talk to Krista, who recently used an important resource in CommonGround. Take it away, Krista.
Hi, everybody. I'm Krista. I'm a certified peer specialist, and I work at Human Services, Inc. I recently used the Are You Over-Medicated video and also the worksheet that comes along with it to speak to my doctor, because I'm a person in mental health recovery myself. And it was really helpful because the video, talks about, reasons why you may be over-medicated, or do you feel tired, do you feel kind of lethargic during the day, things like that. And I was feeling that way. So I went in with my doctor after filling out the Are You Over-Medicated worksheet. And what I did was I checked, how many antipsychotics I'm on, how many antidepressants I'm on, how many mood stabilizers, and how many anti-anxiety medications I'm on. Basically, after talking to my doctor and giving him these worksheets, and he looked at these, he agreed with me, because I feel like, I had the voice and I was being assertive about talking to him, that, maybe I was over-medicated. So what he did was he reduced one of the medications I'm on, and that would be done slowly. And so that's working out well. And we talked about reducing another one once I get some blood work from my physical health doctor, just to make sure everything's okay before he reduced another one. So it was really helpful, and this is something that we can help with our peers that come in. And so it's just a great resource for people to use. Thanks so
Krista.
much.
Yep. So, I think in some ways I create things in some ways that I wish I had, of course, and I wish I had CommonGround and the tools in the software program to help me be a more effective partner in my own care. And so in terms of what we see for outcomes, we've had PCORI grants and a variety of other research from other, like from Dartmouth and from University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, studying our outcomes. And what we find is that, certainly through personal medicine and stuff, people seem to get more engaged and activated when measured on the patient activation measure. We see in one large hospital network that has 11 residents working in the ambulatory care clinic, lower emergency room and inpatient admissions, an improvement in communication, or satisfaction with communication with psychiatric care providers. Over time, using the program, folks seem to have fewer concerns about the impact of the meds on their health, and fewer concerns about side effects, and an increase in belief that the meds are actually helping me. People have an improved satisfaction with care, as well as a recent study by Molly Finity here in New York State on improved medication adherence among people diagnosed with schizophrenia. So those are my thoughts for the moment, and I'd really like to just invite any questions, comments. Yeah, hi.
Hi. Fabulous talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hang on one second.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I'm the mother of a daughter with schizoaffective disorder. Your talk was fantastic.
Thank you.
What's your attitude towards medication and how important it is in recovery? How much effort do you put into tweaking it, and when do you say, let me use the other techniques to live with the symptoms as they are?
Sure, that's a great question. So thank you for that. My sense is and as you can see from my life's work, I consider to be medicine to not just be what you take, but medicine is also the things that you do. And by reclaiming that sort of much older historical sense of the word medicine, I think it opens us up to understand that both have to happen simultaneously. Discovering a sense of agency, discovering that I am not a victim of my neurotransmitters, if you will, discovering that there are things I can do, even if it's just sit in a room and with my back away from the door. That might help me feel just a nudge less anxious, because I might have concerns about who might be coming through that. You know what I'm saying? Just that one thing, and to raise that up and to celebrate that and say, that actually helps. That helps you feel just a notch less. Instead of a 10 on anxiety today, you're feeling a 9. You did something that made a difference in your experience of this symptom, right? And that there's an incredible power in that. So that what begins to happen is a kind of synergy between psychiatric medicine and the things I do, which is also medicine. And the reason I call, in my work, this phenomena personal medicine is because people already attach an inordinate amount of importance to the pill. But a pill doesn't recover us. That a pill can, when combined with what I do, accelerate my recovery in really good ways. Also, equally as important, a medicine, a pill medicine, can actually block my recovery, as you heard in the early part of my story, right? That is a wrong use of psychiatric medicine. Psychiatric medicines should support this process of recovery. They are not either or. They are one journey because I'm one person. This is my body, right? And so finding that synergy between what I'm doing and what I'm taking, I think can open up a pathway into the life I want for myself. So that's how I think about that.
Anna, did that answer your question? Pat? Are you on medication?
All right, the truth. I am on my second week of no medications. It's taken me, I've been on them for 30 years. I've tried going off them at different times in my life, and I've been working on a variety of med reductions for the past 2.5 years, and stand before you medication-free for the first time in 30 years. And one of the things I say to myself about that is, and I say it to a lot of friends and folks, is that there's no shame in using psychiatric medications. And for me, I could come and do a whole nother lecture on the journey to use medications in the recovery process, and it is a journey. And that there is no shame in using these medications, and that, because I think ultimately what I ended up, as I would try to balance that equation of the risks and benefits, and I'd also think about my various trade-offs, is that if I took enough medications to make my voices not be there, I would be so over-medicated I couldn't pursue my passion, which is what I'm doing here today, right? That's not a trade-off I'm willing to make, right? And so finding that right balance between what I'm doing and the stuff that I'm taking has been a hallmark of my journey all these years. That said, as I am aging, I'm aware that there are certain cognitive effects of the medications that I was developing some concerns about, and so for my aging brain, and so in talking with my care providers, decided I want to try again. It's been 2.5 years, but I stand here 2 weeks out, and I'm like, yes. And boy, it was slow. It was a slow reduction.
Other questions?
Hi, Pat. Thanks so much for a transformative and inspiring talk.
Thank you.
And especially for talking about what matters to people as at the core of what recovery is, because what I hear there is that that's really the essence of what is meaningful and helps people in recovery find meaning and purpose. And I have a quick comment and a question. My comment is, one of the things that I hear sometimes, maybe it's also something you could address, is one of the things sometimes I hear about is, yes, but sometimes people, we ask them, would you like to work? And people say no, right? Or would you like to take this on? And people say no, kind of along the lines of what you were sharing, right? And what I think about is the story of a friend of mine who is also in recovery, and he tells this story about how when he was right at the verge of getting married, about to propose to his wife, our boss at the time, who used to work for this advocacy organization, mental health advocacy organization, asked him, would you like to be a parent? Would you like to be a father? And he said, no, not with my diagnosis, not with my history. And I don't think I could do that. And this other man said to him, I didn't ask you if you thought that you could, I asked you if you wanted to. Right? And how often, when we ask that question, we maybe hear, no, I don't want to, but what people are saying is, I don't think I can.
Yeah.
So my question is really more related to the topic of culture as well, which is what matters to people is really embedded in our cultural identities. And I wonder how that's played out, or that plays out in your work, and if you could talk about that too.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the story, because it's really, that's a good lesson for me. I hadn't quite heard it put that way, and I find it the difference between I don't want to and I can't. Kind of defeating myself before I even get off the starting block, I think, is critically important. And, you know, I don't think that, I mean, I think, so one of the things that's raised sometimes when we talk about recovery in a larger cultural dimension of it is, what does it mean to, for instance, recover a sense of hope for one's own life and return to a community that's permeated with a profound sense of hopelessness and no possibility of being able to advance my life, and it being pure folly to even consider that I can advance in my life in ways that are meaningful. Where I come from a community of people who say, maybe it's not so good to even try. You'll just get knocked down again, that kind of despair. And I don't know the answer to that dilemma. You know, where culture intersects with our institutions, where culture intersects with with the whole recovery process. I mean, I think it's a huge question, and it's not my area of expertise, although there are other people like yourself that I can point to that make a tremendous difference in helping make our work much more multidimensional. And for that, I'm really grateful for the work you and so many others do.
Let me put Stephanie on the spot by asking, you know, before Pat's talk, I was mentioning to her that the current way in which mental health services are deployed in this area and in the country is not congruent with what is the best way to deliver population mental health for a whole variety of reasons. But if we were going to adopt more of a sort of peer-centric and common ground approach to mental health services, how readily or not do you think this would map onto the public mental health sector?
Well, first, thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderful. And this whole row behind us here are public psychiatry fellows. So these are young psychiatrists who are going out there to make the kind of changes that you're talking about. And to your question, Jeff, I think it's absolutely, we can change the systems of care that we have to incorporate recovery-oriented thinking. And it really is about how you think about what your role is, both the person who's being treated and the people providing the treatment. Because we're both responsible. I think Pat sort of showed this in the beginning. It really, and it takes empowerment, but to empower people who have had power taken from them, we have to give up some of our power. And I think that that's something that's hard for clinicians in general, psychiatrists. It's a cultural issue, right? About giving up some of our power to allow other people to have power. And in doing that, it allows for that dialogue. It allows for the shared decision-making. It allows for people to have a voice, because they are the experts in their lives. But we have to think differently. And we have to think differently about the role of the psychiatrist. We have to think differently of the role of our healthcare systems. Because our healthcare systems were actually built to serve our needs more than the people who we're providing the care for. So we have to think about how we structure programs. We have to think about taking the medical model and chipping away at it a little bit to allow us to have a more holistic approach to care. I think that there are programs developing around the country, and at last count, there are 22 public psychiatry fellowship programs nationally that are trying to start with the psychiatrists and teaching them to think more broadly about their role and not just use a medical model of, symptom management and illness reduction, but who is this person? How can I join with this person and help this person to live the best life that they can? So these guys are going out there to do that. And I think it's absolutely possible. And I think with Pat's work and others around the country who are really trying to push back on the medical model and think more broadly about how we provide care, that will cause a systems change. And we also have to mention this, Medicaid and how we pay for services also has to change so that we can change the systems. So we take a systems-based practice approach to designing systems of care, which is also essential.
Jean Marie, don't leave.
Next.
No, so I just asked Stephanie, and she said, by all means, it's feasible. So Jean Marie is the director of the Washington Heights Community Service. So what do you think?
So I agree. We are doing it, but I think that the last point about the financial implications are really important. And so how do you pay? Because if you're not able to reimburse for services, then how do you provide salary support for the lines? And that becomes really crucial. And especially if you want to scale up the amount of peer services that would be really along the lines of the CommonGround model, so that you're really touching 100% of patients that are coming in. You wanted to offer that to everybody. You have to have more peers. So even in our service at the Washington Heights, we have 2 peers that are across 1 inpatient unit and over 1,000 outpatients. That's not enough, right? So that's just not enough. And so that's really pushing that and advocating for that.
How do you think the staff would, assuming that we could solve the financial problem, how do you think, because Stephanie said we have to give up some power, it's not just psychiatrists, it's all the disciplines. How do you think staff would react to that?
So actually, that's an interesting question. There have been a lot of both positive and sort of growing pains about trying to incorporate peers into the existing mental health structures, because you have to understand how to engage with a partner in your treatment that is also a consumer of services of the same treatment that you're providing. And so having that person be on the team and also being a consumer is interesting and does have a lot of implications for having the providers have a shift in terms of their thinking about who's on the team and what that means to be on the team. And but overall, people are very interested and appreciate the perspective that the peer has in terms of being able to engage the patient more, being able to provide an example where we can say it as a psychiatrist or as a therapist, we can say that this is how you can grow and this is how can you get help and this is how you can recover and you can go back to work. But it's so much more meaningful to see it from somebody who's standing there and saying it and doing it and living that. And so many therapists and psychiatrists understand that and appreciate it. And then they're then committed to sort of working out the growing pains of what that actually logistically means day to day of providing the service together.
No, I would say, it's not just peers, incorporating peers, it's really a model of care. Peers are just part of it, but it's really a model of care that applies to all of the staff in the program. Is it correct that this model is applied in the more substantial or most substantial way of all of our services on track, or not yet?
I mean, Pat, we could ask Pat to speak to that because I think, Pat, you have a lot of window onto how On Track New York programs function and it plays out. So,
Yeah, so I think that, I've been with On Track since it was an NIMH-funded research project back in 2009 and continue with it today. And so it was part of the formation of what the team principles would be, and certainly shared decision-making and recovery are both at the heart of it. And I can't help but have some of the CommonGround work that I do also be a part of it. And so, but not formally. So they've not formally adopted this model. I think there are aspects of it that really don't apply very well. For instance, people get to spend much more time with their psychiatric care providers in the on-track model than in a 15-minute standard med clinic visit, for instance. That said, the on-track teams are using my online recovery library where tools like Are You Over-Medicated is available, and we're routinely making sure that the teams are up on all of that good stuff. So.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of our time. We could have gone on for a lot longer, I'm sure, and we'll have the opportunity to continue with the discussion at lunch. But let me just say that thank you for really an inspiring talk. And what you're saying, really, it's focused on us and mental health care and psychiatry. It really would apply to all of medicine. And it's not just a model of care. I mean, in many ways, these are really fundamental life lessons which you've learned the hard way. So thank you for sharing it with us. And as I said to you before, we're going to engage you more and more, take advantage of your bandwidth or expand your bandwidth, and move towards this as readily as we can. So thank you, and those of you who want to go upstairs.
Thank you very much. There's two things.